Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. What you're watching now is my reader's guide to Dante's Divine Comedy. I'm going through all three books, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. For any new viewers, I'd like to first of all welcome you and say thank you, and also ask you to please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It would really help me out. I appreciate it a lot. Also, for new viewers, know that I've already completed the Reader's Guide to Dante's Inferno, which you will find linked to down in the show notes below. Also in the show notes below, you'll find a link to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante project. The 100 Days of Dante project is what originally inspired me to produce these Reader's Guides, and I think that you will enjoy them as much as I have, and I am enjoying them quite a bit. In fact, they're already up into paradise while we're still stuck down here on the mountain of Purgatory. So check them out, but also check me out. I think you'll like what you'll find here. Thanks again for coming. And with all that out of the way, let's hop right into it. Today's video is for Dante's Purgatorio, Canto 11. Things open today with the prideful penitent sinners chanting a variation of the Lord's Prayer as they labor under their heavy burdens. Dante wonders how he can help them. Virgil, more practically, and this is important for any male readers of this canto, recognizes that he and Dante are lost, so he asks for directions. The life lessons in this poem are bountiful. One of the penitent, prideful sinners, and we're not sure who, responds that if Dante and Virgil would like to ascend up the mountain, then they will have to stay with the penitent sinners on the right. So they do. And as they walk along, our two poet pilgrim heroes encounter and interact with a few of these penitent sinners. The first is Umberto Aldobranesco. This guy is very proud of his name, and who wouldn't be? It's got more O's than an episode of The Sopranos. But probably more importantly for the poem, it's a famous family name. A Ghibelline family, actually. I just realized there's an opportunity for a very good drinking game for any readers groups reading through the Divine Comedy. Every time a Guelph or a Ghibelline appears, you take a shot. Anyway, Dante and Virgil move along, and soon they come upon another sinner, and this man's name is Oderisi Dugubio. At least that's how I think you pronounce his name. And this guy is famous for being an illuminator, that is, a painter of manuscripts. And his sin is the pride that he takes in his fame. Dante speaks with Oderisi for a little bit, and we get some wonderful passages about the vanity of fame. Really good stuff. Oderisi, he goes full Ecclesiastes here. I love it. Oderisi also prepares Dante to meet another penitent sinner, Provenzano Salvani. Dante is confused about how this man, Provenzano, got here so quickly. After all, Provenzano, we're told, is a late repentant, and Dante understands that late repentants, as we understand from our previous encounters in the Antipurgatory, are doomed to Antipurgatory for 1 year for each year that they failed to repent in their life. And yet, this man Provenzano, Dante understands, has recently died. So how did he get to Purgatory so quickly? Further, in yet another prophecy of Dante's upcoming exile, Oderisi says that Dante will also in the near future have humility thrust upon him, just as did Provenzano. Oh, and by the way, Provenzano is a Ghibelline. In terms of characters and themes today, what I'd like first to discuss is the penitent sinner's variation of the Lord's Prayer. And then after that, we'll get into some of the individual characters that we meet in this canto and what they mean for the poem at large. Finally, we'll talk about the sin of pride in its relationship to Dante himself. The first thing we notice about the penitent sinner's variation of the Lord's Prayer is that it is a prayer. So once again, we see the centrality of prayer and its importance in this poem, Purgatorio. The importance of prayer is emphasized by the fact that whenever we meet a new group of penitent sinners, that is, when we reach a new terrace of purgatory, we see such sinners are engaged in prayer. That's our first impression of these penitent sinners. They're engaged in common prayer. Here's what Ciardi has to say about this communal variation of the Lord's Prayer. The prayer spoken by the souls under the stones is, of course, an extended form of the Lord's Prayer. and Dante's choice of it must be understood by its relevance to the sin of pride. The Lord's Prayer is so basic to Christian practice, and so much the possession of every Christian child, that its very nature as a primer of the creed must explain its first relevance here. If pride is seen as a blind and arrogant assertion of secondary things, self, power, family name, talent, etc., it follows that such a wrong emphasis on what is secondary can only be arrived at by ignoring what is primary. It is in these terms, I believe, that Dante's intent can best be grasped. The proud must begin over again as children, learning the first expression of the first principles of faith. It is exactly relevant that the first child's prayer is also the most central to Christian belief. Note, moreover, that every petition of the prayer is for the grace of humility and subservience to God's will, and that the last petition is for the good of others. One last thing about this prayer, though, is that upon closer examination, it becomes clear that Dante's version of the Lord's Prayer in this canto is based as it was in the Latin Vulgate Bible. Just like with Dante's own poem, then, the poem we're reading, he's showing a preference for the use of the vernacular in the presentation of Holy Scripture. So perhaps if he was born a little bit later, he would have been sympathetic to the Reformation. Okay, so now let's talk about the individual characters that we meet in this canto. We meet 3 new characters up here. 2 we meet in person, and 1, at least we hear about them. For me, the most important thing to understand about these characters is not necessarily who they are or what they did while they were alive. The most important thing readers should take away from these characters, and indeed from the characters we'll meet on the Mountain of Purgatory throughout the rest of the poem, is what they have to teach us about the sins that they represent. Specifically, how best to avoid these sins. Let's take a close look at something that Virgil says early in this canto to better understand this point that I'm trying to make. Let's look at lines 37 through 45, where Virgil asks for directions up the mountain. Please, so may justice and mercy soon unburden you and give you wings to life up as high as you desire. Show us the shortest crossing to the stairs, and if there is more than one ascent, let us know where the drop is not so steep. For he that comes along with me, burdened with the weight of Adam's flesh, though eager to ascend, is slow at climbing. Now on the surface it appears that Virgil is simply asking for directions, and that's true enough. But remember, Purgatory Mountain is a metaphor for the purging of sins and the cleansing of souls. So what Virgil really might be asking for here is what metaphorical steps we can take to avoid falling into the sins of the penitent sinners that he's going to be engaged with. Further, he's also asking on behalf of someone burdened by Adam's flesh. Do you know anyone else who is still burdened by Adam's flesh? Sure you do. Me, you, anyone reading this really. So what I'm saying is that throughout the rest of the poem, as we meet the different penitent sinners, we're going to learn not only what sins have landed them in purgatory, but we're also going to learn the antidotes to the poison of such sins. So as you read further in this poem, keep on the lookout for these antidotes. Read actively and with purpose. And don't forget that, as we've said in previous videos, the most obvious antidotes to these sins are found in the virtuous examples, led by Mary, that appear at the beginning of each terrace of purgatory. That said, these sinners also have some things to teach us. Let's look first at Umberto Adambranesco, the first prideful penitent sinner we meet in this canto. This guy is being punished for pride of birth. That's right, he's proud because he was born to a rich and powerful family. Proud that you're born. Congratulations, that's something you share with literally everyone who ever existed. If we're being charitable, and we always should be, and in fact on the next terrace we're going to learn that charity is an antidote to envy, we can see that this guy Umberto does have good reason to be proud of his family name. He was born to a rich and powerful Ghibelline family. Whew. Now let's look closer at the first words that old Umberto has for us. His speech appears in lines 48 through 72 of the canto, and his speech is in response to Virgil's asking for directions. 3 of these stanzas of his speech in particular are important for our purposes. It was an Italian, a noble Tuscan son. Guglielmo Adambranesco was my father. I do not know if you have ever heard his name. The ancient blood and gallant deeds done by my forebears raised such an arrogance in me, that forgetful of our common mother, I held all men in such great scorn, it caused my death. How, and all see and know, and every child, and compiantico. The first thing to note is that the exemplars of humility, as shown in the grand marble carvings of Mary, David, and Trajan from the previous canto, are already at work here. Umberto is getting better at showing humility, however imperfectly. He states, I do not know if you have ever heard his name, in reference to his father. Remember, Umberto is being punished for the sin of pride of birth. By his own admission during his life, he never would have thought that people didn't know his name. Now, however, burdened by this rock, and possibly by contemplation of the marble carvings, he's been made more humble. Now, how can we become more humble in life if, like Umberto, we're proud of our birth? What's the antidote he offers us here? I think the antidote to pride of birth is a constant meditation on human universalism and cosmopolitanism. After all, Umberto says that his pride of birth raised such arrogance in me that forgetful of our common mother, I held all men in such great scorn. So the opposite of this sentiment is cosmopolitanism and universalism. The accident of birth, whether to a rich or a poor family, doesn't matter. What matters is that we're all part of the same human family, and within this context, there is no room for haughty pride. The next penitent sinner that we meet is Orderici de Gubbio, and he is currently being purged of the sin of pride of talent. And what was he so prideful of exactly? Well, he was a famous illuminator. I'm not even sure if this job still exists anymore, so if you don't know, illuminators worked in scriptoriums, and their job was to illuminate or illustrate manuscripts that were produced in these scriptoriums. Medieval graphic designers, essentially. If you look at an illuminated text from the Middle Ages, you'll find that not only would the script, the words, and the text on the page be decorated, but there would also be a miniature, a picture, and a kind of border decoration, and maybe even a decorated letter to start each chapter. So let's look closer at what Orderici has to say in order to find the antidote to pride and talent. Here's what he says. O vanity of human powers, how briefly lasts the crowning green of glory, unless an age of darkness follows. Worldly fame is nothing but a gust of wind, first blowing from one quarter, then another, changing name with every new direction. Straight out of Ecclesiastes. I love it. The antidote to pride of talent is the understanding that, to quote the great George Harrison, all things must pass. All is vanity, because all things wither away like fallen autumn leaves. I mean, really, who among us has even given a single thought to the craft of illumination recently, let alone this particular illuminator? Nobody. So if something is so fragile that it breaks from the simple passage of time, then what truly is there in such a thing to take pride in? The bottom line here, the thing that Orderici teaches us is that time consumes all. Time is the great humbler. Time will eat even Beethoven. So what chances does your fame, however large or small, have of enduring? No chance. Our very lives and the things that we do in them are as abiding as the morning dew. And on that happy note, I'd like to move us along to Provenzon Salvani, the last penitent sinner that we meet with in this canto. Well, we don't really meet with him. Orderici tells us about him. And this guy, Provenzon, his sin was the sin of temporal power. We don't get his name from Orderici, but based on what Orderici says, we can pretty much tell who he is with some accuracy. And who he is basically a powerful Ghibelline who led the attack against the Florentine Guelphs in 1260. But his life and what he did with it isn't what's important here. What's important is why he's here on this terrace of Purgatory and not down in the Antipurgatory. Dante and Virgil learned that he was a late repentant, recently passed away in fact. So naturally they ask why he's here instead of in the Antipurgatory. After all, the late repentant sinners, they were told, are supposed to be in Antipurgatory, aren't they? Well, Orderici's answer provides us with the antidote to pride and temporal powers. He says of Provenzon, while he was living his greatest glory, he said, he willingly sat in the marketplace of Siena, putting aside all shame, and there, to redeem his friend from the torment he endured in Charles's prison, he made himself tremble in every vein. What's going on here? Well, Provenzon, we're being told, is able to skip Antipurgatory and go straight to Purgatory proper, not only because he repented in his life, but also because he humbled himself in his life, and he did so under his own volition. So the antidote to pride of temporal power, then, is to live selflessly and other-directed, rather than self-directed. Provenzon humbles himself for the benefit of his friend. And that brings us to our final point, which is Dante the poet's relationship to the sin of pride. A lot of the commentary on this canto is about this topic. There's a general consensus that the sin Dante himself feels most strongly about is the sin of pride. This is the one that he thinks himself most guilty of. Why would the greatest poet of all time think that, I wonder? I mean, it is clear after reading this canto that Dante is worried that when he dies, this is where he'll end up going. After all, in lines 118 through 120, he expresses pain upon listening to Orderici's words. He's pained probably because he recognizes in these sinners the same pride that he has in himself. Let's also look at the way in which the penitent sinners speak and how Dante kind of imitates this manner. When we first hear someone talk, we don't see who it is. They can't show their face. They don't immediately announce their names. This is appropriate because as penitent sinners of pride, they should speak anonymously, taking no pride in their names. In line 73, take notice of this, Dante also bends down his face so that he can speak with these penitent sinners. This is important, as it shows that Dante is probably aware that his pride will condemn him to these very parts after his passing. In fact, in an upcoming canto, he's going to admit as much. So stay tuned. For today's takeaway, what I'd like to do is consider the antidotes to pride that we've spoken about in the characters and themes section. A thread through all these antidotes is that the things that we take pride in, and indeed life itself, is temporary, passing, and therefore, in the ultimate analysis, completely meaningless. If we can remember this then, we can work on curbing the pride that we take in life and the damage that this does to the soul. We are weak, watery beings standing in the midst of unrealities. Therefore, let us turn our minds to the things that are everlasting. Let us look up to the ideal outlines of all things that flit about on high, and to the God who moves among them, and plans how he may defend from death that which he could not make imperishable, because its substance forbade, and so by reason may overcome the defects of the body. As for man, his days are as grass. As a flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. Alright, so that's the video from my reader's guide to Canto 11 of Dante's Purgatorio. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed producing it for you. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helped me out. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. But more importantly than getting likes for the video or subscriptions to the channel is getting a conversation going down in the comments. So let's get that started. Let me know what you think about this canto. Let me know what you think about this poem. Let me know what you think about my thoughts on this canto or this poem. Can't wait to hear from you. I'm looking forward to it. These videos are now going to be published every Tuesday evening and every Thursday evening. So the next video is going to be released on Thursday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.